They protected abusers, exposed victims, and still made zero arrests. What is really going on inside Trump's Department of Justice?
Senator Whitehouse.
Thanks. Since we're waiting for a quorum and since we're considering U.S. attorneys today, I wanted to draw a little bit of attention to the situation with the U.S. attorneys in Missouri and in Georgia with respect to the affidavit that supported the search and seizure of the Fulton County election records. Having been a U.S. attorney, the way that this ordinarily works is that if you have a multi-state investigation, the U.S. attorney who is running the investigation brings in the U.S. attorney for a state in which material is sought, in which a search warrant is going to be executed. And that U.S. attorney goes to their local judge, gets the search warrant, and then the materials go to the U.S. attorney who's leading the investigation. In this case, the U.S. attorney from Missouri cut out the U.S. attorney from Georgia. So if this case were to go to trial or to be charged, the defendant would have some interesting questions about why the Department of Justice didn't follow regular procedure. If they pursued that, they'd find out that the U.S. attorney from Missouri who did this is riddled with election denial history from his previous career and is tied in with some of the worst election denial people in the administration who talked to him about this. So that opens a whole other avenue for a defendant, if charges are ever brought, to challenge what went on in that process. To make it worse, the local special agent in charge of the Atlanta field office was quit or was forced out just days before this search warrant, which is strongly suggestive that the local FBI office wanted no part of this and that he might even be objecting to it. Again, another avenue for a defendant to explore in the event the charges were ever brought. Then you get to the affidavit itself, which is weird in at least two respects. First, it left out a lot of information about the credibility of anonymous witnesses that were cited in the affidavit. There was enough information about those so-called anonymous witnesses that it's not that hard to figure out who they were. And once you know who they are, it's not hard to figure out that the affidavit left out significant information about their role in the election denial conspiracy in Georgia. Why would an FBI agent leave out that information that goes to the credibility of those witnesses? Again, if you have a defendant, that is a question the defendant gets to explore, and it's not going to make the search look good. Why open that avenue? Then the affidavit left an explicit out in which the agent said, you know, maybe there's no crime here. So there's some real sensitivity because that is very uncommon language in a search warrant affidavit predicated on investigation of crimes. Lastly, there were some very strange officials present, including a very senior Department of Justice FBI official and the Director of National Intelligence. I'm aware of no occasion on which the Director of National Intelligence has ever attended the execution of a search warrant. It is exceedingly bizarre. More than just being bizarre, though, it opens up a challenge for any ultimate defendant. Because any person who shows up at the execution of a search warrant is a witness to the execution of the search warrant and is amenable to discovery, to examination by a defendant. That's why when I was the U.S. Attorney in Rhode Island, when I was the Attorney General in Rhode Island, I made a point of not going to the site of the execution of a search warrant because I would have made myself a witness as to the execution of that search warrant, and there's no need for that. It is bad practice to have unnecessary people at the execution of a search warrant. Now, with respect to the Director of National Intelligence, she's also the coordinator of something called the Weaponization Task Force, the Weaponization Working Group. I call it Weaponization Task Force because it's WTF. I mean, seriously. Why would you want to have the person who started and is a key part of this so-called weaponization group, which works secretively within the Trump administration, exposed to the examination of a defendant if charges are brought? Why would you want to open all of that up? It makes no sense. So when you add all of that up, you're faced with the question, was this the most incompetent search warrant ever? Do they really not know what they're doing enough that they make rookie error after rookie error after rookie error after rookie error that would expose the government to considerable examination by a defendant? Is that what that was? Or was it something worse? Was it that they never expected that there would ever be a defendant? So all these holes in that search warrant affidavit, in that search warrant process, in that search warrant execution would never be explored because there'd never be a defendant. And if they expected that there would never be a defendant, then the big lie in that search warrant affidavit is that they were pursuing evidence of a crime. It suggests very strongly that they were not pursuing a criminal investigation and opening up all those avenues of challenge, but rather all they wanted to do was to get their hands on that election information, which they had tried to do over and over again civilly, which they had failed in doing. And maybe this was the last desperate effort to fake a criminal investigation, to get their hands on election information so they can monkey wrench Georgia elections with that information in the future. That is as plausible an explanation of what took place as any other. In fact, a good deal more plausible. So as we're considering U.S. attorneys, it's worth paying attention to the mischief that is being done by this Department of Justice and, I guess, by the Director of National Intelligence using regular processes of the Department of Justice, not following the proper procedures for those processes, and having an ulterior motive, which in this case may very well be to add to election interference in Georgia by faking a criminal execution with a fake criminal search warrant with a fake criminal affidavit, search warrant affidavit behind it. Thank you very much.
What we just witnessed in that hearing isn't just political drama. It's a window into how power is being used and possibly abused at the highest levels of government. A Democratic lawmaker from New York stood up and did something simple but powerful. He asked a direct question about justice for the victims of Jeffrey Epstein, and the answer he exposed was chilling. Let's start with the basics. Survivors of one of the most horrific abuse networks in modern history were sitting in that room. These are people who have waited years for justice. And what did the Department of Justice deliver? Not protection, not accountability. Instead, according to the claims raised, the DOJ released information that failed to properly protect victims while shielding the identities of alleged abusers. That alone raises serious ethical and legal concerns. But it doesn't stop there. The bigger issue is what didn't happen. No major indictments, no aggressive pursuit of co-conspirators, no sense of urgency. And that's where the contrast becomes impossible to ignore. Because while victims connected to Epstein are still waiting for justice, enormous resources, time, personnel, investigations have allegedly been redirected toward political targets. Take Letitia James, for example. She spent years holding Donald Trump accountable for financial misconduct, and suddenly she becomes the focus of repeated federal investigations that, according to this exchange, failed not once, but twice to secure an indictment. That's not normal. Grand juries almost never reject indictments, yet here it happened twice in the same week. That tells you something critical. The evidence wasn't there. And when prosecutors refused to move forward without evidence, they were replaced. Think about that. A system that's supposed to be built on facts and law begins to look like it's being driven by loyalty and political pressure instead. That's not how justice works in a democracy. That's how power gets weaponized. Now step back and look at the bigger picture. On one side, you have survivors of abuse still waiting for accountability. On the other side, you have political opponents being investigated again and again, even when the evidence doesn't hold up. That imbalance is what people are reacting to. That's what makes this moment so serious. Because justice isn't just about punishing wrongdoing, it's about trust. Trust that the system is fair. Trust that victims are protected. Trust that the law applies equally to everyone, no matter how powerful they are. And when that trust starts to break down, the consequences go far beyond one case or one hearing. It affects the entire foundation of democracy. This is why Democratic voices continue to push for transparency, accountability, and real oversight. Not because it's politically convenient, but because without it, the system fails the very people it's supposed to protect. At the end of the day, the question remains simple, and it's the same one asked in that hearing. How many perpetrators have actually been held accountable? If the answer is 0, then something is deeply wrong, and it's something the American people cannot afford to ignore. If you believe in accountability, if you believe victims deserve justice, and if you believe no one should be above the law, then this is the moment to pay attention. Share this, start the conversation, and demand better, because silence is exactly what allows systems like this to continue unchecked.